Senator, you wrote a letter Friday to the Senate Appropriations Committee asking for disaster relief dollars for desperately needed resources to rebuild Florida communities. After Hurricane Sandy hit northeastern states in 2012, you voted no on a $50 billion relief package.
What a relevant question to ask the senator from Florida, Marco Rubio, especially after Hurricane Ian destroyed some portions of the state, including areas like Fort Myers, which has been almost completely wiped out as a result of a storm surge. Now, these hurricanes, of course, have been happening in Florida, but they're happening more frequently. They've become more intense. There's all sorts of issues involving, yes, climate change, overdevelopment. And so maybe it's a bad idea to vote against disaster relief funding when you know for a fact that your own state suffers from these natural disasters and tends to need help. But Marco Rubio isn't the only Republican lawmaker who has voted against disaster relief funding. You have Rick Scott, who used to be the governor of Florida, but is now a lawmaker. These are both Republican senators from the state of Florida who voted against the federal funding for hurricane relief. But now, they're soliciting some help from the federal government. They need some funds and they have signed on to a letter asking for those funds. Here's what the letter says. A robust and timely federal response, including through supplemental programs and funding, will be required to ensure that sufficient resources are provided to rebuild critical infrastructure and public services capacity and to assist our fellow Floridians in rebuilding their lives. This was a letter sent to the Senate Appropriations Committee, essentially soliciting some government funding to help rebuild parts of Florida that have been destroyed. Now, I think that it is the right thing to do. The whole point of the government is to protect its constituents, to respond to these kinds of emergencies and these disasters. Marco Rubio, Rick Scott, people like DeSantis are getting a lot of heat for being massive hypocrites for previously voting against this type of relief funding. But wait till you get a load of Matt Gaetz, who's actually even worse if you ask me. But before I get to him, John, I want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, my thoughts are that he's a weenie and a weasel. Pick your W word, he's that thing. He's why people hate politicians, because he's so clearly lying about something very, very important, using lies that have been debunked literally 5 years ago and still continuing to spread those lies. The host on the broadcast that you showed did a good job of both framing the conversation around his obvious hypocrisy, and then when he told lies about why he supposedly did what he did, she was ready with at least a little bit of fact checking on that. The issue though that puts us in a bit of a bind is that a lot of Florida voters won't necessarily see this, but even if they were to, I wonder how much they would care. Because think about the hypocrisy. So he was against the funding when it was, say, Hurricane Sandy or something, and he's for the funding now. I bet they probably agree with him on both of those things. They probably don't care if New York City or New Jersey or something gets the funds they need to recover, and they definitely want the funds for themselves too. Is it possible that his hypocrisy is actually kind of representative of what a lot of people who, they're probably not thinking too much about this. They're not necessarily focusing on the human cost of having politicians like Marco Rubio who don't give a damn about what happens in any other part of the country. But I wonder if they would honestly just agree with his stances.
Well, I think that is an important point to make, John, and I think you're unfortunately correct about that. And it's because the country is so divided that we almost see individual states as entirely different countries that are enemies rather than fellow Americans that we should support, even if they have political views that differ from our own, right? So to your point about Dana Bash having some facts ready to debunk the lies that Marco Rubio was telling, I do want to show that portion of the conversation and then fill you in a little more, because what Marco Rubio was essentially saying was, well, I voted against it because there was all this pork that wasn't related to disaster relief. That was a lie. And the fact of the matter is, it doesn't seem like he has any concern about other Americans in other states needing assistance and relief after a natural disaster. So without further ado, let's watch that video.
Why should other senators vote for relief for your state when you didn't vote for a package to help theirs?
Oh, I've always voted for hurricane and disaster relief. I've even voted for it without pay-fors. What I didn't vote for in Sandy is because they had included things like a roof for a museum in Washington, D.C., for fisheries in Alaska. It had been loaded up with a bunch of things that had nothing to do with disaster relief. And I wouldn't support disaster relief efforts. I would never put out there that we should go use a disaster relief package for Florida as a way to pay for all kinds of other things people want around the country.
I read the Congressional Research Service report last night. It sounds like that roof actually was damaged by the hurricane, and what happened in Alaska was the result of another disaster. But in any event, my question is about the future. Are you telling me that if Hurricane Ian relief contains anything that smells like pork, you'll vote no?
Sure.
Sure. I mean, he just says it. But again, let's double down on the incredibly critical point here, which is Marco Rubio didn't vote down that bill because it had pork that was unrelated to disaster relief. The other provisions absolutely did have to do with disaster relief. It's just that it had to do with disasters in other states that he doesn't care about at all. And so literally one day before he and Rick Scott had sent that letter to the Senate Appropriations Committee, he voted against the stopgap measure that would have provided hurricane relief funding. The stopgap spending bill that the Senate passed on Thursday includes about $18.8 billion in additional funding for the Federal Emergency Management Agency to respond to Hurricane Ian and future disasters. All 25 senators who refused to vote for the bill were Republicans. And Rick Scott voted against it, along with Marco Rubio, who didn't vote at all. He abstained. But Rubio does have a history of voting against disaster relief funding. For instance, in 2013, he voted against the $50 billion relief bill meant to help states impacted by Hurricane Sandy, which of course left a trail of damage on the East Coast and hundreds dead. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who was a congressman at the time, also voted against multiple bills that would have provided aid to victims of Sandy. And so this is an ongoing trend. You see it happen over and over again. And it's just amazing to me because whenever they're in need, whenever they need to deliver for their constituents, all of a sudden they pretend like they're pro relief funding. But fact of the matter is, they're always against it. They always vote down those types of bills because, first of all, they never want to think about what could happen in the future. They never want to be prepared for any natural disasters, which inevitably happen. But they also point to all the other provisions that help other states out. Are we the United States of America, or is it just about Florida? It's crazy.
I thought they valued unity. I found out after Biden's speech a month ago. Yeah, and look, we can definitely talk about how, we're all going to be affected by the ravages of climate change. It's going to be incredibly damaging and incredibly costly all over the country, but not equally distributed. Florida's probably going to be hit harder. And so when he helps to stop the prevention that would be necessary to make that extra damage in future decades not happen, we're gonna be footing the bill as a nation for the extra costs that Florida and places like it are gonna be required. And we'll pay it because we do believe that we're the United States of America. But why is it that he gets to make us pay even more? That we could stop it from happening. That would be nice, I would love to do that. He won't let us do that. Republicans like him won't let us do that. And so we're obligated in future decades to send the buckets necessary to save Miami. We'll do it again because we actually have compassion and we care, but they're not just stopping the aid after the disasters, they're making the disasters more likely to be terrible in the future. But the one other thing I wanted to say was when it comes to her fact checking, which I think was okay, and it's about as much fact checking and as vigorous fact checking as you're allowed to do in the media. But imagine if it was-
It's as good as it gets, John. On CNN, it's as good as it gets.
It is, but imagine if instead of, oh no, I looked into both of those and that was actually disaster relief funding. Well, moving on, imagine if instead he says they fixed a roof and that wasn't disaster relief funding. They fixed these fisheries in Alaska and that wasn't disaster relief funding. Imagine if she'd come back and said, oh my God, have your aides, has your office so misinformed you? Dear God, you were trying to do the right thing, but they gave you this terrible information. No, the facts are that all of that was disaster relief funding. Do you now regret the horrible mistake that you made in voting against that? When obviously your heart was in the right place. Or if he were to potentially be able to remember another example, we talked on the damage report about New York Times did a fact check. Ted Cruz's office put together 21 things that were in that legislation that they opposed as pork barrel spending. Only one was not actually related to the disaster relief spending. So 20 of their examples were for disaster relief. So put him on the spot and say, since this cannot be the reason you opposed it because your reasons make no sense, what's the actual reason? And Senator, if you would like to move on to other topics, we'll get to that after you answer this. If not, we can just end the interview because you're clearly lying to myself as well as people who've been through these disasters. Why did you actually oppose this since your argument is BS? They could never say it, but imagine if they did.
I mean, that would be interesting to watch him weasel his way out of. I think it'd be difficult for him to do it. But yeah, I mean, that would be a great line of questions or great line of questioning. Because look, when we talk about division, they're the ones who sow it, right? They're the ones who have this us versus them mentality. My heart breaks for people in Florida. And when you talk about Fort Myers, you look at the before and after photos of Fort Myers. I was just in Fort Myers last July with family there. I was there with my in-laws. And we had a great time. Usually when I go visit my in-laws there, we'll take a quick trip to Fort Myers. It's only 2 hours away from where they live, and take like a little mini vacation together as family. And we've built some memories there. And the majority of the local community there is absolutely Republican. I believe like 60% of the voters there cast their ballots for Donald Trump. Who cares? I don't care. At the end of the day, they're Americans. They've been devastated by what happened. They absolutely deserve the federal relief. I'm happy to see that money go toward them so they can rebuild their lives. But what makes, I think, some Americans different from others is you have some Americans who they don't see other people who have different political beliefs or might live in a different state as their peers or fellow Americans. They just see them as the others, regardless of race, regardless of religious creed. They don't care. And that kind of division is destroying this country in so many different ways. I get it. We're gonna have political ideas that differ. We get angry, we debate those ideas. But to have this inhumane, callous response, this us versus them kind of response when people are in need, it's just disgusting. And that's not what leaders are supposed to do. That's not what public servants are supposed to do. But Marco Rubio actually isn't as terrible, believe it or not, as some other Republican lawmakers based in the great state of Florida, because Matt Gaetz proudly voted against disaster relief funding and admitted that he voted against it because he doesn't want to give Democrats a win during this lame duck session. I'm not even kidding. So here's, let's go to his statement here, because he was asked about it. Gaetz joined dozens of his colleagues in signing a letter that said they would, quote, do what is necessary to prevent additional funding for the Biden administration. Okay, this is not funding for Biden. This is funding for the people in Florida or other states that have experienced terrible natural disasters and need help rebuilding their lives. The letter continues to say any legislation that sets the stage for a lame duck fight on government funding gives Democrats one final opportunity to pass that agenda. John, what exactly is that agenda? If I recall correctly, the agenda here with that funding is to provide relief to people in the state of Florida.
Yeah.
Where Matt Gaetz is a lawmaker.
No, this is literally like drowning your constituents to own the libs. It's like Brandon is desperately trying to help you dry off all of your possessions and get the power back up. But Matt Gaetz thinks that you would rather see him look bad than actually be able to live in your home or have your businesses open once again. I am assuming that there are not a lot of Republicans, even that like Matt Gaetz, that actually believe that. I am hoping that this is him misreading the room. I don't know, we'll see. I doubt he's gonna be booted out of Congress over like so abdicating his ethical responsibilities to his constituents.
Well, the constituents need to know about what Matt Gaetz is up to and what he's doing. And if you live in a media bubble that purposely censors that kind of content, you're just not aware. You're not aware of your lawmakers literally working against your best interests. It is insane. But it is heartbreaking. I feel terrible for people who have been impacted by this hurricane. Again, Fort Myers, like looking at those pictures, I was on vacation when it all happened, but looking at those pictures, I was just tearing up because I can't imagine just watching your entire life just be submerged in floodwaters and it's all gone, and to know that you live in a state that doesn't typically like to help people out with government programs, that's also terrifying.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.